"We told you what you needed to hear to protect your future," my mother said, her voice as smooth and frictionless as the $4,000 Hermes silk scarf draped meticulously around her neck. She did not even deign to look up from the liquid retina display of her 12-inch iPad Pro, her manicured thumb scrolling through some auction catalog while she sipped chilled San Pellegrino from a Waterford crystal glass. I was standing in a kitchen that had cost exactly $120,000 to renovate last summer, a space of cold Calacatta marble and custom white oak cabinetry that felt more like a mausoleum than a heart of a home. In my trembling hand, I held a thick manila envelope, the edges frayed from the frantic way I had ripped it open in my car. Inside was the undeniable clinical proof that my parents had faked my best friend's death for a decade. "My name is Amelia Vance. I am 27 years old, and I am currently the highest-paid crisis management PR executive in the city of Boston, working out of a glass-walled office on State Street where I charge $600 an hour to make the sins of the elite vanish. I spend my professional life cleaning up the scandals and moral collapses of the wealthy, but today, I am not here to scrub the blood off the floor. Today, I am the one starting the fire that will burn the Vance legacy to the ground. Before the first match is struck, before I show you how I systematically dismantled my family's multi-million-dollar empire during the height of my sister's $80,000 gender reveal baby shower at the Mandarin Oriental, you need to understand the weight of the silence I lived in for 10 years. For a decade, I believed that Chloe Bennett, the girl who had shared my bed during thunderstorms and whispered her darkest secrets into the crook of my neck, was buried in a closed casket in a plot of land I visited every Christmas. I believed the story my father, Julian Vance, a man whose real estate portfolio spans half of the East Coast, told me about a tragic drunk driving accident on a rainy Tuesday night in October. But standing in this kitchen, the scent of expensive eucalyptus candles choking the air, I looked at the private investigator's report that proved Chloe wasn't dead. She had been paid off, relocated to a small town in Oregon, and threatened with a non-disclosure agreement so ironclad it could withstand a nuclear blast, all because she had seen something on my father's laptop that would have ended his career before his first major acquisition. The silence in the kitchen was broken only by the low, expensive hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator, a machine that cost more than most people's first cars. My mother, Evelyn, finally glanced at me, her eyes reflecting the cold gray of the Atlantic. She looked at the envelope in my hand, then back at her screen, dismissive as always. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, a physical manifestation of 10 years of grief that had been built on a foundation of calculated lies. I thought of the 2024 Midnight Black Tesla Model S I had parked in the driveway, a car I bought with my own hard-earned money, a car that represented my independence, and I realized that no matter how much success I achieved, I was still just a pawn in their game of optics. My father entered the room then, his footsteps muffled by the hand-woven Persian rug that cost $60,000 at a Sotheby's auction. He was wearing a custom-tailored Brioni suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, smelling of Tom Ford Oud wood and the arrogance of a man who has never been told no. He didn't ask why I was there. He didn't ask why I looked like I was about to vomit. He simply checked his Patek Philippe Nautilus watch, a $200,000 timepiece that counted the seconds of a life lived in total deception, and told me to make sure I wasn't late for the shower. My sister Charlotte was expecting everything to be perfect, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a command. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the titan of industry. I saw a hollow man who had traded his daughter's soul for a higher credit rating. I thought about the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had spent on my education at Harvard, the way they had paraded my career successes at every gala as proof of their superior genetics, all while knowing they had hollowed me out from the inside. The contrast between the life they projected and the rot underneath was nauseating. My sister's baby shower was scheduled to begin in 3 hours in the ballroom of the Mandarin Oriental, overlooking the public garden. The floral arrangements alone, featuring rare white peonies flown in from France, cost $15,000. There would be 300 guests, including the governor and half the board of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. It was the perfect stage. As I stood there in that $120,000 kitchen, I felt the shift in my own internal geography. The girl who used to cry at Chloe's grave was gone. In her place was the woman who knew exactly how to destroy a reputation because she had built her career on saving them. I knew the exact pressure points of my father's various LLCs. I knew which journalists at the Boston Globe were hungry for a lead that would win them a Pulitzer. I knew the login credentials for the internal server of Vance Holdings because I had been the one to set up their digital security protocols during my first year as a consultant. I looked at my mother, who was now complaining about the acidity of the San Pellegrino, and I felt a strange, cold peace. It was the same feeling I got right before I went live with a press release that would bury a competitor or exonerate a high-profile client. It was the feeling of total control. I didn't say a word to them about the envelope. I didn't scream or demand an apology that would never be sincere. I simply tucked the manila folder under my arm, adjusted the strap of my $5,000 Prada Galleria bag, and walked out of the house. The heavy mahogany front door clicked shut behind me with a sound that felt final. I sat in the driver's seat of my Tesla, the leather interior still smelling like the showroom, and I didn't start the engine immediately. I watched the sprinklers on the front lawn of the Vance estate, a 4-acre plot in Chestnut Hill, as they sprayed a fine mist over the perfectly manicured grass. Each rotation of the sprinkler head felt like a countdown. I pulled out my phone, an iPhone 15 Pro Max, and opened my encrypted messaging app. I sent a single PDF file to a contact named Marcus, a senior investigative reporter I had fed dozens of stories to over the years. The file contained the bank transfers from Vance Holdings to a shell company in Oregon, the forged death certificate, and the original police report that had been buried in the archives of the Hartford PD. The drive toward the Back Bay was smooth, the Tesla's autopilot navigating the midday traffic with eerie precision. I passed the boutiques on Newbury Street, where the windows were filled with items that cost more than a year of college tuition, and I felt like a ghost moving through a world I no longer belonged to. My parents thought they were protecting my future by erasing my past, but they had forgotten one fundamental rule of crisis management. The truth doesn't stay buried. It just ferments. By the time I reached the valet at the Mandarin Oriental, my phone was already vibrating with a return call from Marcus. I didn't answer. I wanted him to be as desperate for the full story as I was for justice. I walked into the hotel lobby, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the hushed tones of the wealthy. The ballroom was a sea of pastel blue and gold. Charlotte was standing in the center of the room in a maternity dress made of Italian lace, laughing with a group of women who all wore the same uniform of Botoxed foreheads and Chanel flats. She looked radiant, the golden child who had never asked questions, the daughter who had stayed within the lines my father drew for her. She saw me and waved, her smile bright and empty. I smiled back, a professional mask that I had perfected over years of high-stakes negotiations. I took my seat at the head table, right next to the reserved spot for our parents. My father would be giving a speech in 20 minutes, a toast to the next generation of the Vance legacy. I reached into my bag and felt the cold, hard plastic of the thumb drive I had prepared. It was loaded with the same documents I had sent to Marcus, plus a video file I had recovered from a corrupted hard drive 3 nights ago. I had spent $4,000 on a forensic data recovery specialist to get that video, and it was worth every penny. It was a recording from the night Chloe disappeared, captured by a doorbell camera 3 houses down from the supposed accident site. It didn't show a crash. It showed my father's black 2014 Mercedes S-Class pulling over, and it showed a terrified 17-year-old girl being forced into the back seat by 2 men in dark suits. The waiter, a young man who looked like he was struggling to pay his tuition at Northeastern, poured me a glass of 2012 Dom Perignon. I watched the bubbles rise to the surface, each one a tiny explosion. I thought about the thousands of dollars my family spent on charities every year to keep their names on the walls of hospitals, while a girl I loved was living in a trailer park in Oregon under a false name, her life stolen so a real estate mogul could keep his reputation. My mother arrived then, sitting down and immediately adjusting the placement of her salad fork. She didn't look at me. She was too busy scanning the room to make sure the right people were seeing her at the right table. I leaned in close to her, the scent of her expensive perfume cloying and suffocating. I whispered that she looked beautiful in the scarf. She finally smiled at me, a genuine look of approval because I was playing my part. She had no idea that in 15 minutes I would be walking up to the technician running the slideshow for the baby shower and handing him a new drive. She had no idea that the future they had worked so hard to protect was about to be liquidated. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that usually comes during a hostile takeover or a midnight damage control session. But this wasn't damage control. This was a demolition. Family isn't the people who share your blood and lie to your face to keep their bank accounts full. Family is the person who remembers the truth of who you were before the world told you who to be. As my father stood up and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon, the room went silent. He cleared his throat, his face beaming with the pride of a man who owned the world. I stood up too, my legs steady, my mind sharp. It was time to start the fire. The contrast between my reality and the architectural lie of my family's existence was measured not just in emotional distance, but in the cold, hard mathematics of 10 years of wasted, hollow grief. I spent 10 consecutive agonizing autumns driving out to a desolate stretch of road near Route 9, where the asphalt is cracked and the air always tastes like damp earth and exhaust, to leave $65 bouquets of premium white lilies at a memorial site that I now know was nothing more than an empty, mocking patch of grass. I would kneel there in the dirt, my knees staining the fabric of my expensive trousers, whispering secrets to a ghost while the wind whipped through the trees, never realizing that the person I was mourning was breathing the air of a completely different coastline. To process the trauma of that supposed fatal car crash, a nightmare manufactured in my father's wood-paneled study, I spent over $48,000 on twice-weekly therapy sessions in a high-end Back Bay office overlooking the Charles River, where the mahogany furniture and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock provided a rhythmic backdrop to my unraveling. I sat on a sage green velvet sofa for 520 weeks, paying a specialist $350 per hour to help me navigate a survivor's guilt that was actually a carefully injected poison, a psychological tether designed to keep me compliant and broken while the real architects of the tragedy moved on without a single backward glance. Meanwhile, my sister Madison, the perennial golden child and the undisputed center of the Vance gravitational pull, lived a life of unearned prestige and shimmering porcelain perfection that made my manufactured misery look like a necessary sacrifice for her brilliance. She moved through the world with the effortless grace of someone who has never had to look at a price tag or a police report, currently driving a pristine 2024 Arctic white Mercedes GLE that smelled of expensive leather and Joe Malone English pear and freesia. Her wrists were weighted down by a stack of 318-karat gold Cartier love bracelets, each worth $7,000, their screw motifs symbolizing a permanence and a bond that our family had long ago betrayed in favor of self-preservation. While I was counting the pennies of my grief, Madison was currently overseeing the final touches of her $15,000 floral budget for this afternoon, a display of opulence so grotesque it felt like an insult to the very concept of nature. She had insisted on rare imported orchids and hand-dyed hydrangeas that had to be kept at a precise 62 degrees to prevent wilting, all of it funded by the same man who had written a check to make her darkest sin disappear into the fog of a New England autumn. The truth of that night 10 years ago was a jagged glass shard buried deep in the foundation of this house, a hit-and-run accident committed by a 16-year-old Madison who had been driving my father's car without a license after a party she wasn't supposed to attend. My father, Julian, hadn't called the authorities or an ambulance. Instead, he had used his immense political capital and a series of offshore wire transfers to exile my best friend Emma, the girl who had been in the passenger seat and the only witness who couldn't be bought with a simple apology. He had manufactured a narrative of Emma's death in a separate, fiery collision to ensure I would never go looking for her, creating a fictional funeral and a closed casket that I had sobbed over until my lungs burned. He had effectively murdered her identity to save Madison's Ivy League applications, turning Emma into a ghost and me into a shell, all while Madison continued to win equestrian trophies and debutante titles as if her hands weren't stained with the metaphorical blood of a friendship she had helped incinerate. Standing here now, watching Madison adjust the empire waist of her Italian silk maternity gown, I realized that every smile she gave me over the last decade was a calculated performance, a way to keep the lid on the pressure cooker of our family's shared, silent crime. Every time I looked at the $70 scented candles burning on the marble mantel, I saw the smoke from a crash that never happened, and every time I heard the soft chime of Madison's Cartier bracelets clinking together, I heard the sound of handcuffs that should have been slapped onto her wrists years ago. My father's cover-up hadn't just been an act of paternal protection. It was a business transaction where my sanity and Emma's entire existence were the currency used to pay off a debt of negligence. The $80,000 baby shower was just another layer of paint on a rotting wall, a celebration of a new life, while the old ones they had discarded were left to wither in the shadows of their collective indifference. I thought of the cold, clinical office in the Back Bay where I had spilled my heart out to a therapist who was trying to heal a wound that was being actively reopened by my own parents every Sunday dinner. The sheer scale of the financial and emotional investment they put into this lie was staggering, from the hush money sent to the local precinct to the private security firm hired to relocate Emma to a tiny, forgettable town in the Pacific Northwest, where she was forced to live under a name that wasn't hers. The air in the Mandarin Oriental ballroom was cloyingly sweet, thick with the scent of the $15,000 worth of flowers that seemed to be mocking me with their vibrancy. I could feel the weight of the manila envelope in my bag, a physical anchor in a room filled with people who floated on the surface of their own vanity. My mother was laughing with the wife of a state senator, her $4,000 scarf fluttering as she gestured toward the elaborate 3-tier cake that cost more than a month of my rent in a luxury South End apartment. I watched Madison, the girl who had nearly killed a pedestrian, and then watched her father ruin another girl's life to cover it up, as she rubbed her belly with a look of practiced, saintly serenity. She was the star of the show, the princess of the Vance Empire, and I was just the reliable, quiet sister who handled the family's public relations, the one they expected to stand by and nod while they toasted to a future built on a graveyard of secrets. The injustice of it was a physical weight behind my ribs, a cold, sharp pressure that made it hard to breathe the filtered, climate-controlled air of the hotel. I remembered the night of the supposed accident, the way my father had sat me down in his leather chair, the smell of expensive scotch heavy on his breath as he told me Emma was gone, his voice cracking with a manufactured sorrow that I had mistaken for genuine empathy. He had spent 10 years watching me struggle, watching me fail to form deep connections because I was terrified of losing people the way I lost her, all while he knew exactly where she was and how much it cost to keep her there. The $48,000 I spent on therapy wasn't just a waste of money. It was a testament to his success in gaslighting his own child into a state of permanent mourning. Every white lily I had placed on that empty patch of grass near Route 9 was a tribute to his ability to manipulate reality, a $65 reminder that he owned the truth, and I was only allowed to see what he permitted. Now, as the waitresses moved through the crowd with silver trays of lobster gougères and miniature quiches, I felt a sense of clarity that was almost blinding in its intensity. The time for grieving a lie was over, and the time for exposing the architects was beginning with a precision they wouldn't see coming. I wasn't just going to tell the truth. I was going to dismantle the entire infrastructure of their prestige, piece by expensive piece, starting with the very event designed to solidify their legacy. Madison's white Mercedes, the Cartier bracelets, the floral arrangements that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. It was all going to be collateral damage in the fire I was about to light. I looked at my father, who was now shaking hands with a prominent real estate developer, and I saw the cracks in his armor that he was too arrogant to notice. He thought he had bought silence, but he had only rented it, and the lease was up today. The reality of Emma's displacement hit me with a fresh wave of nausea as I realized she had spent a third of her life in a forced exile because of a sister who was currently opening gifts wrapped in $50 embossed paper. While Madison was being showered with silver rattles and designer onesies, Emma was likely working a job that didn't pay enough to cover the therapy she undoubtedly needed after being threatened and uprooted by a billionaire's legal team. My father hadn't just faked a death. He had stolen a life, and he had used me as the primary audience for his elaborate, decade-long performance. The White Lilies were dead, the memorial was a fraud, and the Vance name was about to become synonymous with the very scandals I had spent my career suppressing for others. I stood by the dessert table, my fingers brushing against the cold silver of a serving spoon, and I made a silent vow to the girl I thought was dead. The silence is over, and the bill for 10 years of lies is finally due in full. The architectural precision of the betrayal was finally uncovered in the dimly lit, climate-controlled sanctuary of the four-car garage at exactly 2:14 p.m. on a sweltering Tuesday. A moment that felt as though the very oxygen in my lungs had been replaced by the heavy, metallic scent of motor oil and ancient, suffocating lies. I was in the process of clearing space for the massive professional catering stations that would soon be serving Wagyu beef sliders and truffle-infused arancini to 300 oblivious guests, moving heavy boxes of seasonal decor when a charcoal-gray sentry-safe fire chest, the kind marketed for its indestructible nature, slid from a high mahogany shelf and plummeted toward the oil-stained concrete floor. The latch snapped with a violent final crack that echoed through the cavernous space, spilling its contents across the ground like a confession that had grown too heavy to carry. As I knelt down, my knees pressing into the cold grit of the floor, I began to sift through the mundane debris of a wealthy life, pushing aside yellowed 1998 tax returns and property deeds for vacation rentals in Martha's Vineyard that had long since been liquidated into more liquid assets. Amidst the paperwork of a dead era, my fingers brushed against something that didn't belong in a firebox. A heavy ivory envelope crafted from 300 GSM cardstock, its edges still sharp and its gold foil lettering shimmering with a cruel, mocking elegance under the flickering fluorescent lights of the garage. It was a wedding invitation from Emma, postmarked from Seattle exactly 8 years ago, a physical piece of evidence that shattered the decade-long delusion my parents had meticulously constructed around me. The address was written in her unmistakable loopy cursive, the ink a deep navy blue that seemed to vibrate against the cream-colored paper, and as I held it, the reality of her survival hit me with the force of a physical blow to the solar plexus. My parents hadn't just lied to me in a moment of panic. They had built a sophisticated, multi-layered digital and physical firewall around my life, an invisible prison designed to keep the truth from ever reaching my doorstep. I looked deeper into the spilled contents of the safe and found the invoices, neat and professional, from a high-end private security firm based out of Alexandria, Virginia, detailing a monthly retainer of $2,500. For 10 years, my father had authorized these payments, totaling $300,000 over the decade, specifically to employ a team of digital specialists whose sole job was to intercept Emma's every attempt to reach me through email, social media, or traditional mail. They had monitored my IP address, filtered my incoming communications through a proprietary server, and redirected her letters into this dark, forgotten corner of a garage while I sat in the house above, weeping over a girl I thought had been incinerated in a luxury sedan. The sheer, calculated coldness of the investment was staggering, a financial commitment to my own psychological torture that made my stomach churn with a bile I couldn't swallow. They had let me mourn a ghost, watched me spiral into a depression that cost $48,000 in therapy to manage, all to keep the Vance brand pristine and free from the messy legal entanglements of a hit-and-run committed by their favorite daughter. The invitation in my hand felt like a live wire, the gold foil catching the light as I realized that while I was visiting an empty grave near Route 9, Emma was building a life, getting married, and reaching out to the one person she thought she could trust, only to be met with a silence she must have interpreted as my own betrayal. The garage, filled with the 2024 Arctic White Mercedes GLE and the ghosts of my father's classic car collection, suddenly felt like a crime scene where the primary victim was my own capacity for trust. I stared at the postmark, Seattle, and visualized the thousands of miles between us, miles that had been bridged by her hope and burned down by my father's checkbook. The $2,500 a month wasn't just a security fee, it was the price of my soul, a subscription service to keep me broken so that Madison could remain whole, her reputation unblemished as she moved through her elite social circles with her $7,000 Cartier bracelets and her unearned sense of moral superiority. The air in the garage grew thicker, the smell of old rubber and expensive chemicals mingling with the dust of the 1998 tax returns, creating a sensory cocktail of a life built on a foundation of fraud. I thought of the countless nights I had looked at old photos of us, my eyes blurred by tears, wondering why the universe had taken the one person who truly saw me, never realizing that the universe hadn't taken her at all. My parents had simply bought her absence. Every time I had sat at the dinner table and felt a pang of loneliness, they had been paying a professional to ensure that loneliness remained absolute, effectively ghostwriting my life story to suit their narrative of a perfect, tragic family. The ivory envelope was more than paper. It was a map to a world I had been forbidden from entering, a world where Emma was alive, where she was happy, and where she had wanted me by her side. The gold foil lettering of her name felt like a brand on my skin, a reminder that my entire identity for the last 10 years had been a curated exhibit in a museum of Vance lies. I stood up, my legs shaking but my mind crystallizing with a new, dangerous purpose, the ivory envelope tucked firmly into the pocket of my designer trousers. I looked at the broken sentry safe, its guts spilled out on the floor like an autopsy of my family's morality, and I felt no urge to clean it up. I wanted my father to find it. I wanted him to see the ruins of his secret and know that the firewall had finally been breached. The $300,000 he had spent on the security firm was a drop in the bucket of his multi-million-dollar empire, but to me, it represented the total devaluation of my humanity in favor of a corporate image. I walked back toward the interior door of the house, my footsteps heavy on the concrete, the sound echoing the rhythmic ticking of the Patek Philippe watch my father wore with such pride. As I crossed the threshold back into the $120,000 kitchen, the cool, purified air hit my face, but it didn't feel refreshing. It felt like the breath of a tomb. My mother was still there, now directing a florist on where to place a $5,000 centerpiece of white lilies, the very flowers I had wasted a decade placing on a fake grave, and I felt a surge of cold, sharp laughter bubbling in my throat. The irony was so thick it was suffocating, a poetic injustice that only people with their level of wealth could manage to execute without irony. I watched her slender, manicured fingers point toward the marble island, her $4,000 scarf catching the light from the recessed LED fixtures, and I realized that to her, the lilies were just a color choice, not a symbol of the daughter she had helped me bury while she was still alive. They had turned my grief into a design element, a background noise to their continued ascent into the upper echelons of Boston's social hierarchy. I didn't say a word as I passed her, heading toward the stairs that led to my father's home office, the ivory invitation burning against my hip. I could hear the distant sounds of the event staff arriving, the clinking of silverware, and the muffled instructions of the event coordinator who was being paid $10,000 to ensure Madison's baby shower was a flawless execution of luxury. Every cent spent on this day felt like a stolen dollar from Emma's life, a physical manifestation of the debt my family owed to the truth. I reached the landing and looked down at the foyer, where the sunlight was streaming through the custom-stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the limestone floor that looked like spilled blood. The digital firewall was down, not because of a hacker or a technical glitch, but because gravity had finally done what 10 years of silence couldn't. It had dropped the truth at my feet and waited for me to pick it up. I thought about the private investigator's report in my bag and the ivory envelope in my pocket, two pieces of a puzzle that, when joined, would complete the portrait of a family that had cannibalized its own to survive a scandal. The $2,500 a month was no longer an expenditure. It was evidence of a criminal conspiracy to kidnap a life and gaslight a daughter, and I was going to make sure that every guest downstairs understood exactly what kind of people they were drinking Dom Perignon with this afternoon. My name is Amelia Vance, and while my father thinks he is about to toast to his future grandson, he is actually about to witness the systematic liquidation of everything he spent 30 years building. The air in the house was no longer smelling of eucalyptus. It was starting to smell like the smoke of a fire that had been smoldering for a decade, and I was finally ready to let it roar. I sat in the driver's seat of my 2024 chalk gray Porsche Macan S for 3 excruciating hours, the twin-turbo V6 engine idling so silently that the only vibration I felt was the rhythmic, frantic hammering of my own heart against my ribs. I did not cry, because tears are a physical manifestation of a helplessness I could no longer afford, and in my world, moisture on the cheek is simply a blemish that ruins a perfectly applied layer of $15 Chanel waterproof eyeliner. Instead of collapsing, I reached for my 16-inch MacBook Pro resting on the passenger seat, the cold aluminum casing biting into my fingertips as I flipped the lid open and watched the Retina display illuminate the darkened interior of the garage with a ghostly, clinical glow. I moved with a detached, surgical precision, bypassing my personal accounts to open a secure, encrypted messaging portal to contact Marcus, my lead forensic investigator, and a man whose discreet services cost me a $4,000 monthly retainer. I looked down at the ivory wedding invitation once more, feeling the deep, expensive letterpress texture of the paper beneath my thumb, and I realized that this scrap of cardstock wasn't a memento of a lost friend. It was a high-caliber weapon that had been left loaded in a dusty corner of my father's life. My parents had spent 27 years laboring under the delusion that they were raising a compliant socialite who would eventually marry a legacy partner and quietly manage the optics of the Vance Family Charitable Foundation. What they had actually produced was a woman who understands that information is the only true sovereignty, a specialist who knows exactly where the bodies are buried because she is the one the elite calls when they need to dig the holes and pour the concrete. I opened a fresh, encrypted digital notepad on my screen, the white cursor blinking like a heartbeat, and I began to construct the architecture of their downfall with the same cold-blooded efficiency I usually reserved for high-stakes corporate acquisitions. My first point was to secure the original, unredacted police logs from the night of the accident near Route 9, a task that would require Marcus to bypass the superficial layers of the Hartford PD's digital archive and find the raw data entries that had been suppressed by a $20,000 donation to the PBA. Second on my list was to establish direct contact with the private security firm in Seattle, the one my father had been paying $2,500 a month to play God with my communications, so I could identify the specific individual who had been intercepting Emma's letters and offer them a choice between a whistleblower's immunity or a federal lawsuit for mail fraud. The third and final point on my list was the most critical: the preparation of the gift for Madison's $80,000 baby shower at the Mandarin Oriental, a digital Trojan horse that would ensure that when my father stood up to toast the future, the past would finally walk through the door and demand its seat at the table. To my family, love had always been a luxury, a decorative flourish used to mask the jagged edges of their ambition. But to me, facts were a currency, and I was currently the wealthiest person in the room. The silence of the garage was heavy, smelling of the expensive German leather of the Porsche's interior and the lingering metallic scent of the oil on the concrete floor where the sentry safe had shattered. I watched the progress bar on my laptop as Marcus began the data extraction, the blue line creeping forward as he pulled 10 years of hidden bank transfers and intercepted emails from the Vance Holdings offshore accounts. Every kilobyte of data felt like a nail in the coffin of the Vance legacy, a digital autopsy of a family that had cannibalized its own child to maintain a pristine public image. I thought about the $48,000 I had wasted on therapy, talking to a man in a Back Bay office about a grief that was entirely manufactured, and the anger that rose in me was cold and sharp, a precision instrument that I used to hone my focus. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to liquidate their reputations with such finality that even their names on the walls of the Boston Symphony Orchestra would be scrubbed away like a stain. My father's Patek Philippe watch might count the seconds, but I was the one who was going to decide when the time ran out for all of them. I typed a message to Marcus, my fingers flying across the backlit keyboard with a speed born of a decade of suppressed trauma, telling him that I needed the full dossier on Emma's current life in Seattle, the name of the man she married, the address of her home, and the details of her career, within the hour. I needed to know what they had stolen from her, and by extension, what they had stolen from me, so I could calculate the exact interest on the debt they were about to pay. The 2024 Porsche Macan hummed beneath me, a $75,000 piece of machinery that represented my own escape from their financial control, and I felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that the very skills they had encouraged me to develop as a PR executive were now being weaponized against them. I thought of Madison in her white Mercedes GLE, her Cartier bracelets clinking as she laughed with women who were as hollow as she was, and I realized that she was the ultimate beneficiary of my misery, the one who got to live a life of unearned prestige while I carried the weight of a ghost. The ivory invitation was still clutched in my hand, the gold foil lettering of Emma's name a silent witness to the betrayal, and I tucked it into my $5,000 Prada bag next to my MacBook Pro as if it were a grenade with the pin already pulled. The 3 hours I spent idling in that garage were a transition period, the moment where Amelia the daughter was finally and irrevocably replaced by Amelia the architect of justice. I didn't need to scream or break things. I just needed to ensure that the logic of my revenge was as flawless as a balance sheet. I visualized the Mandarin Oriental ballroom, the $15,000 worth of white peonies, and the faces of the 300 guests who were about to witness the spectacular implosion of the Vance mythos. My father believed that a $2,500 monthly retainer could buy a permanent silence, but he had failed to account for the fact that a firewall is only as strong as the person who holds the administrative password. As I finally shifted the Porsche into reverse and backed out of the garage, the tires crunching on the gravel driveway, I looked at the house one last time, the limestone facade glowing in the afternoon sun, and I felt nothing but a cold, clinical curiosity about how it would look when it was all burned down. The list on my digital notepad was my roadmap, and the first stop was the truth that had been postmarked from Seattle 8 years ago. The drive toward the city was a blur of high-speed precision, the Porsche's navigation system guiding me through the streets of Boston while my mind remained fixed on the 3 points of my demolition plan. I checked my phone, and a notification from Marcus appeared on the screen, a secure link to a cloud drive containing the first batch of documents, evidence of a wire transfer from Julian Vance's private account to a legal firm in Seattle, specializing in non-disclosure agreements and relocation services. The amount was $50,000, dated exactly 2 weeks after the night of the accident on Route 9, a payment for the erasure of a human being. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the leather, and I felt a sense of clarity that was almost transcendental. Every lie they had told, every dollar they had spent to keep me in the dark, was now a line item in my ledger of retribution. Love was a luxury my parents had never been able to afford, and today they were going to find out just how expensive the facts really were. I arrived at my office on State Street, the glass tower reflecting the gray waters of the harbor, and I walked through the lobby with the purposeful stride of a woman who was already in the middle of a hostile takeover. My assistant, a bright young woman who I paid $80,000 a year to be my shadow, looked at me and immediately canceled my afternoon meetings without me having to say a word. She saw the look in my eyes, the one that usually meant a client's career was about to be saved or destroyed, and she simply handed me a fresh cup of espresso and retreated to her desk. I locked the door to my private office, sat down at my glass-topped desk, and reopened my MacBook Pro. The police logs were waiting. The Seattle firm was being contacted by Marcus's associates in Virginia. And the gift for the baby shower, a meticulously edited video presentation that would replace the scheduled montage of Madison's childhood, was being rendered in high definition on a secure server. I took a sip of the bitter, dark coffee and felt the caffeine sharpen the edges of my resolve. The Vance empire was built on a foundation of silk scarves, crystal glasses, and the silent suffering of a daughter who was supposed to be too broken to fight back. But they had forgotten that a person who has lost everything has nothing left to fear. The digital notepad was no longer a list. It was a death warrant for the family name, and I was going to sign it in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. As the sun began to dip behind the Boston skyline, casting long, dramatic shadows across my office floor, I felt a strange sense of peace. The 10 years of grief, the $48,000 of therapy, and the $65 bouquets of lilies were all part of the past now, a history that I was finally taking ownership of. My name is Amelia Vance, and I am the highest-paid crisis management expert in this city because I know how to control the narrative. And today, for the first time in my life, the story was going to be mine. I checked my watch, the same Patek Philippe my father had given me for my 25th birthday, a gift I now realized was a bribe for my continued compliance, and I saw that it was almost time to head to the Mandarin Oriental. The guests would be arriving soon, the champagne would be flowing, and the white peonies would be smelling of a beauty that was entirely skin-deep. I stood up, smoothed the fabric of my $1,000 blazer, and picked up my bag. The engine of the Porsche was cool now, but the fire I had started in that garage was just beginning to catch, and by the end of the night, there wouldn't be anything left of the Vance legacy but ash and the memory of a truth that could no longer be contained. I walked out of my office, the glass doors clicking shut with a sound that felt like the closing of a chapter, and headed toward the elevator. The gift was ready, the facts were in my possession, and the currency of my family was about to be devalued to zero in front of the entire world. I boarded the 6 a.m. Delta flight from Logan International Airport to Seattle-Tacoma, settling into the plush leather of Seat 2A in the first-class cabin while the rest of the world was still draped in the gray, pre-dawn haze of a Boston morning. The cost of the last-minute ticket was $1,600, a negligible sum compared to the decade of lies I was finally preparing to liquidate. And as the Boeing 737 climbed through the clouds, I watched the sunrise ignite the horizon with a cold, pale gold that matched the fire in my own chest. Meeting Emma again after 10 years of mourning her was like seeing a specter slowly turn into flesh and bone, a surreal transition that defied every law of the reality my father had spent $300,000 to maintain. She did not live in the dilapidated trailer park I had imagined in my darkest nightmares of her exile. Instead, she met me at the gates of a staggering $4.2 million glass and steel compound on the northern edge of Mercer Island, a masterpiece of Pacific Northwest modernism that looked out over the steel-gray waters of Lake Washington. We spent 5 grueling, exhaustive hours in her sun-drenched living room, the air smelling of expensive espresso and the crisp scent of the surrounding pine trees, going over every granular detail of the night that had split our lives in two. Emma sat across from me, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted the evening Madison had steered my father's car into a pedestrian near Route 9, her voice steadying only when she described the terrifying aftermath in my father's mahogany-paneled study. She told me how my father, Charles Vance, had stood over her with the cold, calculating detachment of a man closing a real estate deal, offering her $50,000 in vacuum-sealed cash to disappear into the night or face a framed felony hit-and-run charge that his friends in the district attorney's office were already prepared to sign off on. I recorded every syllable of her testimony on a professional-grade Sony ICD-TX660 digital recorder hidden inside the lining of my $5,000 Prada bag, the red light of the device pulsing like a heartbeat as she detailed the non-disclosure agreement she had been forced to sign under the threat of permanent incarceration. As she spoke, the arsenal began to take physical shape on the marble coffee table between us, a collection of documents that would serve as the funeral shroud for the Vance family reputation. I gathered the original, faded NDA with its predatory legal language, the printed bank transfer records from my father's offshore account in the Cayman Islands that proved the source of her initial relocation funds, and the holy grail of our evidence, the unredacted dashcam footage that Marcus had successfully recovered from a decommissioned, supposedly wiped police server in Hartford. The footage was grainy but undeniable, showing the white Mercedes GLE swerving and the subsequent sickening impact, followed by the unmistakable silhouette of my father arriving on the scene 20 minutes later to orchestrate the disappearance of the evidence. It all fit perfectly into a single, slim, black leather Toomey briefcase, a professional accessory that now carried enough explosive material to level a multi-million-dollar empire in a single afternoon. I looked at Emma, really looked at her, and saw the lines around her eyes that 10 years of fear and forced silence had etched into her skin. And I realized that my father hadn't just bought her absence. He had attempted to buy her soul for the price of a mid-sized luxury sedan. The $50,000 he had given her was an insult, a fraction of what he spent on a single charitable gala, and yet it had been enough to leverage her life because he knew she had no one else to turn to once he convinced me she was dead. The betrayal felt like a physical weight in the room, more suffocating than the humidity of a New England summer, and as I zipped the briefcase shut, the sound of the metal teeth locking together felt like the clicking of a handcuff. Emma's husband, a quiet man who worked in high-end software development, watched us from the kitchen, his presence a testament to the life she had managed to build, despite the wreckage my family had left behind, and I felt a surge of protective fury that nearly brought me to my knees. We talked about the intercepted letters, the $2,500 a month my father paid to a security firm to ensure her pleas for help never reached my eyes, and the $48,000 I had spent in therapy trying to heal a wound that was being actively salt-rubbed by the very people who claimed to love me. The contrast between this $4.2 million sanctuary and the empty grave I had visited every autumn was a chasm that could only be bridged by a total and uncompromising destruction of the Vance name. I told her about Madison's $80,000 baby shower, the $15,000 worth of white peonies, and the 300 guests who were currently preparing their finest silk suits and designer dresses to celebrate the continuation of a bloodline built on a hit-and-run and a kidnapping. Emma looked at the black briefcase, and then at me, her eyes reflecting a decade of suppressed grief, and she asked me if I was sure I wanted to do this in front of everyone. I didn't hesitate. I told her that when you build a house out of lies, you don't get to complain when the truth sets it on fire. The drive back to SeaTac Airport was a blur of Pacific Northwest green and the gray of the interstate, my hand never leaving the handle of the Toomey briefcase as if it were the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. I checked my watch, a $200,000 Patek Philippe that I now viewed with the same revulsion one might feel for a blood-stained relic, and saw that I had just enough time to catch the red-eye back to Boston. Marcus messaged me while I was in the boarding lounge, confirming that the digital Trojan horse was ready to be uploaded to the Mandarin Oriental's internal media server, ensuring that the gift would be the centerpiece of the evening's festivities. Every minute I spent in the air felt like an eternity, the hum of the jet engines a low-frequency accompaniment to the tactical plan unfolding in my mind. I thought of my mother, Evelyn, and the $4,000 silk scarf she wore like a noose, and I wondered if she would still find the San Pellegrino refreshing when she was watching her husband's crimes projected in 4K resolution on a 20-foot screen. The arsenal was complete. The bank records, the recorded confession, the dashcam footage, and the original ivory invitation that had started this entire collapse. I was no longer a PR executive managing a crisis. I was the crisis, a force of nature that the Vance family had spent 27 years underestimating because they thought my loyalty could be bought with a Harvard education and a corner office. When I landed back in Boston, the air was crisp and smelled of the ocean, a sharp contrast to the stagnant, expensive air of the house in Chestnut Hill, and I felt a sense of clarity that was almost blinding. I went straight to my office to finalize the synchronization of the files, my MacBook Pro glowing in the dark as I merged the evidence into a single devastating presentation titled The Vance Legacy. The 5 hours I spent with Emma had provided the missing links in a chain of evidence that stretched back 10 years, proving that my father's real estate empire wasn't built on savvy investments, but on the systematic silencing of anyone who threatened his ascent. I looked at the black leather briefcase sitting on my glass-topped desk and felt a cold, professional satisfaction, the kind I usually felt when I successfully buried a scandal for a client. But this time, the high was 1,000 times more potent because the scandal was mine to expose. I thought of the pedestrian Madison had hit, a man named David who had spent 3 months in the hospital and was then paid off by a shell company to move to Florida and never speak of the accident again. My father had treated human lives like line items on a balance sheet, and today I was going to show him that some debts carry an interest rate that can never be paid off. I checked the local time, 4 p.m., which gave me exactly 3 hours to change into my formal wear and make my entrance at the Mandarin Oriental. I chose a dress that cost $4,000, a sharp, structured silhouette in a shade of midnight blue that looked like the sky right before a storm breaks, and I styled my hair with a severity that matched my resolve. As I walked out of my apartment, the Toomey briefcase felt light in my hand, its contents no longer a burden, but a liberation that I had been waiting for since I was 17 years old. The white peonies at the hotel would be wilting by the time I was finished, and the $80,000 my sister had spent on her celebration of new life would be remembered only as the price of her public execution. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out, and as I signaled for my 2024 Porsche Macan to be brought around by the valet, I knew that by midnight I would finally know who my real family was. The specter had turned into flesh in Seattle, and now it was time for that flesh to walk into a ballroom in Boston and reclaim the 10 years that had been stolen. I pulled out of the driveway, the engine idling with that same silent, predatory hum, and headed toward the back bay to finish what my father had started on Route 9 a decade ago. The execution was set for Saturday at exactly 1:00 p.m., a time when the high summer sun over our Chestnut Hill estate was at its most unforgiving, illuminating every blade of the perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass and every false smile reflected in the crystal stemware of the elite. The 3-acre grounds were currently crawling with 85 of the most influential figures in the tri-state area, a strategic guest list that included Senator Higgins, the managing partners of the top 3 law firms in Boston, and the entire executive board of Vance & Sons, all of whom were currently milling about under a series of white high-peak tension tents that cost $12,000 to rent for the afternoon. The catering staff, a small army of young men and women in stiff black vests and crisp white shirts, moved through the crowd with practiced anonymity, serving miniature Maine lobster rolls drizzled with clarified butter, and pouring endless streams of Veuve Clicquot Yellow Label into flutes that shimmered like diamonds in the afternoon light. I arrived at the estate not as the dutiful daughter or the quiet PR shadow, but as the architect of their collective undoing, wearing a sharp, structured black Alexander McQueen grain de poudre wool suit that cost $4,500. A sartorial middle finger that stood in stark and aggressive contrast to the nauseating sea of pastel silk sundresses and floral prints that surrounded me. while the other women in attendance were carrying designer diaper bags filled with organic swaddling blankets or clutching silver Tiffany & Company rattles wrapped in blue ribbons, I was carrying a single high-speed encrypted USB drive in my pocket and a heavy, weighted black Toomey briefcase containing a stack of 100 high-gloss, professionally printed folders. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of $15,000 worth of white peonies and the cloying, sweet aroma of the $5,000 custom-made 4-tier vanilla bean cake that sat on a pedestal under the central gazebo, decorated with hand-molded sugar lace that matched the Italian embroidery on Madison's maternity gown. As the clock struck 1:15, my sister Madison, the golden child whose entire life was a monument to a crime she had never been forced to acknowledge, stood up and smoothed the fabric over her stomach, preparing to give a rehearsed speech about the sanctity of family legacy and the importance of the Vance name. She looked radiant in the way only a person with a completely scrubbed conscience can, standing next to my father, Julian, who held a microphone in one hand and a glass of vintage champagne in the other, his face beaming with the pride of a man who believed his 30-year streak of successful deceptions would never end. I didn't wait for her to finish her opening sentence about the beauty of new beginnings. Instead, I began my measured, rhythmic walk toward the 85-inch Samsung Terrace outdoor projection screen that had been set up on the north lawn to show a sentimental montage of Madison's childhood. The grass crunched under my $700 Gianvito Rossi pumps as I moved, the sound muffled by the low hum of polite conversation and the distant tinkling of a live harpist playing a contemporary arrangement in the corner of the garden. I could see my mother, Evelyn, sitting in the front row of the white garden chairs, her $4,000 Hermes scarf fluttering slightly in the breeze, her expression one of serene, bored accomplishment as she watched her favorite daughter take center stage. They had no idea that the gift I had prepared wasn't a collection of grainy home movies from our summers in Nantucket, but a chronological autopsy of the Vance family's morality that would be broadcast in ultra-high definition to the very people whose respect they craved more than life itself. I reached the media console hidden behind a floral arrangement of white hydrangeas, my hands steady and cold, and I felt the weight of the ivory wedding invitation from Seattle in my pocket. A reminder of the 10 years of grief that had been weaponized into the fuel for this moment. I looked at the 85 guests, seeing Senator Higgins nodding along to Madison's platitudes, and I realized that the only thing more expensive than the Veuve Clicquot they were drinking was the silence my father had tried to buy with his $2,500 monthly retainers to a private security firm. As I inserted the high-speed USB drive into the port, the screen flickered to life, momentarily capturing the attention of a few guests who were expecting to see photos of a toddler Madison in a tutu, but instead were met with a black screen and a single line of white text, the cost of a legacy. I didn't look at my father yet, but I could feel his gaze shifting toward the screen, the confusion starting to knit his brow as the first file began to play. Not a movie, but the raw, unedited dashcam footage from the night on Route 9, the audio capturing the sickening thud of the Mercedes hitting the pedestrian and the panicked, high-pitched sobbing of a 16-year-old Madison. The ballroom quiet of the garden was instantly replaced by a stunned, suffocating silence as the images of my father arriving on the scene 20 minutes later appeared, his voice clear and resonant through the high-end Bose outdoor speakers as he instructed the two men in dark suits to take the girl and make sure she never sees the East Coast again. I stood there in my McQueen suit, a silhouette of vengeance against the backdrop of their pastel-colored lies, and I watched as the color drained from my mother's face, her hand flying to the silk scarf at her throat as if it were suddenly choking her. The execution was unfolding with a surgical precision that even my highest-paying PR clients would have admired, each slide of the presentation revealing another layer of the financial and legal fraud my father had committed to protect Madison's unearned prestige. I hit the command key on my laptop, and the screen transitioned to a high-resolution scan of the bank transfers from the Vance Holdings offshore account in the Cayman Islands, showing the $50,000 initial payment to Emma and the subsequent monthly payments to the security firm that had been intercepting my life for a decade. I could hear the audible gasps from the board members of Vance and Sons, men who had staked their own reputations on my father's integrity, as they watched the digital paper trail of a kidnapping and a cover-up scroll past their eyes. Madison had stopped talking, her mouth frozen in an O of silent horror, her hand still resting on her stomach as if she could shield her unborn child from the radioactive truth that was currently melting her world. I finally looked at my father, and for the first time in 27 years, I saw the titan of industry look small, his Patek Philippe watch catching the sun as his hand began to shake, the crystal glass of champagne slipping from his fingers and shattering on the bluestone patio with a sound that felt like the final gavel of a death sentence. I didn't stop there. I opened the black Toomey briefcase and began to walk through the rows of guests, handing out the 100 high-gloss folders with the detached efficiency of a flight attendant, ensuring that Senator Higgins and every board member held physical evidence of the crimes they were currently witnessing on the screen. Each folder contained the private investigator's report, the forensic data from the Seattle firm, and a copy of the ivory invitation Emma had sent me 8 years ago, the letter my father had paid $30,000 a year to keep me from ever reading. The gift was a total liquidation of their social capital, a bankruptcy of the soul that no amount of real estate holdings or charitable donations could ever rectify. The scent of the peonies now felt like the smell of a funeral, the white petals mocking the purity that had never existed in this family. And as I reached the end of the second row, I stood directly in front of my mother, handing her the final folder. She looked at me with eyes that were wide with a terror I had felt every night for 10 years, and I simply leaned in and whispered that the San Pellegrino was starting to taste like salt. The 2024 Porsche Macan was waiting for me at the end of the driveway, the valet having already been tipped $100 to keep it idling and ready for a swift departure. But I wasn't in a hurry to leave. I wanted to savor the atmosphere of the empire as it finally collapsed under its own weight. I watched as the board members of Vance and Sons stood up in unison, their faces masks of professional disgust, and began to walk toward their cars without saying a word to my father, leaving him standing alone next to the $80,000 baby shower decorations. The high-speed USB drive had done more damage in 6 minutes than 10 years of silent mourning ever could, proving that the truth is the only currency that doesn't devalue when the market crashes. As I walked back toward the projection screen to retrieve my drive, I passed the $5,000 cake, which was now attracting flies in the afternoon heat, a perfect metaphor for the rotting core of the Vance family legacy. I took the microphone from the stand where Madison had dropped it, the feedback a sharp, piercing whine that cut through the low murmurs of the remaining guests, and I spoke for the first time since I had arrived on the estate. "My name is Amelia Vance," I said, my voice amplified by the $12,000 sound system until it echoed off the limestone facade of the house. And for 10 years, I believed I was the only survivor of a tragedy. But today I realized I was the only person in this family who wasn't a criminal. I looked at my father, who was now sitting on the edge of a garden chair, his head in his hands, and I told him that the $2,500 a month he spent to keep me in the dark was the worst investment he had ever made, because it had only succeeded in turning his daughter into the woman who would eventually destroy him. I turned and walked toward my car, the black leather briefcase swinging by my side, the weight of the folders gone but the power of the facts still coursing through my veins like a drug. As I pulled out of the gates of the estate, the Porsche's engine humming with that familiar, predatory silence, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the white tents of the baby shower looking like discarded tissues on the green lawn. The execution was complete. The Vance name was effectively dead in the city of Boston, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel the need to visit a fake grave or leave $65 bouquets for a ghost. Family isn't the people who build firewalls around your heart to protect their bank accounts. Family is the truth that remains when all the money and the silk scarves and the crystal glasses are gone. I headed toward the airport, my phone already vibrating with a call from Marcus to confirm that the Seattle firm's NDA had been legally voided by the evidence of coercion. And I realized that while I might be starting over with a tarnished name, I was finally doing it with a clean conscience. The fire I had started in the kitchen had finally reached the ballroom, and as the sun began to set over the Charles River, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat and everything to do with the light of a truth that could finally breathe. The time for whispers and carefully curated press releases had officially ended, replaced by the cold, amplified resonance of my own voice cutting through the humid afternoon air via the $12,000 Bose outdoor surround sound system that had been installed specifically for this celebration. I stood at the edge of the limestone terrace, my black Alexander McQueen suit absorbing the harsh sunlight like a void, and looked directly at the man who had spent $300,000 over a decade to ensure I remained a stranger to my own life. "Let us talk about the true, unredacted cost of the Vance legacy," I said, the words projecting with a clinical sharpness that bypassed my father's attempt to interject, and without waiting for a flicker of permission or a nod from the patriarch, I pressed the tactile glass surface of my tablet to hit play. The 85-inch high-definition screen did not display the expected montage of my sister Madison's childhood achievements or her equestrian trophies. Instead, it flashed with a searing white background spreadsheet of security logs from the Alexandria-based firm my father had kept on a $2,500 monthly retainer. The guests, including the high-ranking board members of Vance and Sons and the local political elite, froze with their chilled hors d'oeuvres halfway to their mouths as the screen began to scroll through a decade of intercepted emails, private messages, and the frantic, heartbreaking pleas for help from Emma that had been rerouted to a dark server before they could ever reach my inbox. The high-fidelity speakers then carried the weight of Emma's recorded confession, her voice trembling but clear as she described the night of the hit-and-run and the $50,000 in cash my father, Charles Vance, had used as a silencer to protect his preferred daughter's future. I watched my mother, Evelyn, as she sat in a front-row garden chair that cost $400 to rent, her hand spasming so violently that her glass of $12-a-bottle Chardonnay, the vintage she insisted on for large crowds to save on the bottom line, slipped from her manicured fingers and shattered across the imported Italian travertine tiles with a sound that felt like a starting pistol. The shards of glass glittered like diamonds in the sun, mocking the carefully constructed purity of the afternoon, while the 300 guests remained paralyzed by the 1080p resolution of my father's moral bankruptcy. I did not stop the presentation. I began to move through the rows of white chairs with a stack of 100 high-gloss black folders, handing them out to the very people my father had spent 30 years trying to impress, ensuring that every handsomely paid lawyer and real estate developer held a physical copy of the original Hartford police report he had suppressed with a $20,000 donation. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was a deafening, pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the garden, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Senator Higgins' leather Oxfords as he stood up without a single word to my father and began the long walk toward his black 2024 Cadillac Escalade idling in the driveway. It was the sound of a political career detaching itself from a sinking ship, a calculated exit that triggered a mass exodus of the board members who had once called my father a titan of industry. I watched as my father's face, usually the color of a healthy, expensive tan from weekends in Palm Beach, turned the bruised, mottled purple of spoiled meat, his jaw working silently as he searched for a narrative that could possibly survive the weight of the wire transfer receipts currently being passed from hand to hand. The Golden family, the Vance empire, and the $80,000 baby shower were all being incinerated in real time by the heat of cold, hard data and the digital ghosts of the secrets they thought they had buried under enough money to buy a new reality. Every folder I handed out was a nail in the coffin of their prestige, containing the forensic audit Marcus had performed on the offshore accounts used to pay for Emma's forced relocation to Mercer Island and the legal correspondence from the Seattle firm that had enforced her silence under the threat of a framed felony. I stood near the $5,000 custom cake, which was now a grotesque monument to a future that was dissolving before it could even begin, and I felt a sense of clarity that was almost blinding in its intensity. Madison was slumped in her chair, the Italian lace of her maternity gown looking like a shroud in the harsh light, her Cartier love bracelets clinking together as she buried her face in her hands, finally realizing that the $15,000 floral budget couldn't mask the scent of the crime she had committed at 16. The white peonies seemed to wilt as the guests continued to flee, leaving the estate in a frantic rush of slamming car doors and the gravel-crunching retreat of luxury SUVs, until the only people left on the north lawn were the architects of the lie and the daughter they had underestimated for 27 years. My father finally stood up, the microphone he was supposed to use for a toast still clutched in his hand, but the Bose system remained silent because I had cut the feed to his channel, leaving him to scream into a void of his own making. He looked at the folders scattered across the lawn like autumn leaves, each one a physical manifestation of the $48,000 I had spent in therapy and the 10 years of white lilies I had wasted on a fake grave. The contrast between the vibrant pastel decorations of the shower and the cold, clinical evidence on the screen created a surreal landscape of a life that had been liquidated in less than 15 minutes. I checked my own Patek Philippe watch, a $200,000 piece of jewelry that felt like lead on my wrist, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was no longer an employee of the Vance image, no longer a crisis manager scrubbing the blood off their marble floors, but a free woman standing amidst the ruins of a dynasty. The security logs continued to scroll on the 85-inch screen, a digital list of every time Emma had tried to call me, every time she had sent a letter that was intercepted by a man my father paid $2,500 a month to play God with my grief. The total cost of my silence was printed in black and white on the final page of the folder: $300,000 in security retainers, $50,000 in hush money, $20,000 in police donations, and $120,000 in kitchen renovations to distract me from the truth. It was a balance sheet of betrayal, a ledger of a father who valued his daughter's Ivy League applications and his own real estate portfolio over the soul of his other child. I watched as the last of the waitstaff retreated into the house, their black vests disappearing behind the mahogany doors, leaving the three of them to face the 1080p reality of what they had done to keep their brand pristine. My mother was staring at the shattered Chardonnay glass, her $4,000 silk scarf dipping into the spilled wine, her eyes vacant as if she were trying to calculate how many charitable galas it would take to fix a disaster of this magnitude. But even she seemed to realize that some stains are permanent. The digital notepad on my tablet was now empty. The list of tasks I had set in the garage finally checked off with a lethal efficiency that proved I was indeed my father's daughter in every way that mattered. Love had been the luxury they couldn't afford, and now the facts were the only currency left on the table, and the Vance family was officially bankrupt in the eyes of the world. I picked up the black Toomey briefcase, the weight of it now a comfort rather than a burden, and began my own walk toward the driveway where my 2024 Porsche Macan was waiting, its engine idling with a low, predatory hum that promised a life far away from the shadows of Chestnut Hill. As I reached the edge of the property, I looked back one last time at the 85-inch screen, which was now frozen on an image of the ivory wedding invitation Emma had sent me 8 years ago, the gold foil lettering shimmering with a beauty that was finally, after a decade of suppression, allowed to exist in the light. The execution was complete, the narrative had been seized, and the golden child's throne was nothing but a pile of expensive lumber and wilted peonies. My name is Amelia Vance, and while I spent my career making the elite's messes vanish, I had finally realized that the only way to clean a house built on lies is to let the truth burn it down to the foundation. I shifted the Porsche into gear and drove away from the wreckage, the sound of the engine drowning out the distant, hollow echoes of a family that had forgotten that the most expensive thing you can ever own is the truth. By 9 a.m. on Monday morning, the fallout from the weekend's high-definition execution had officially breached the fortified walls of the Vance corporate offices, resulting in a sterile 3-paragraph press release stating that my father, Julian Vance, was immediately stepping down from his role as chairman and CEO of Vance & Sons, citing vague and sudden health reasons. The reality, of course, was far more clinical and cold, as the board of directors had spent the preceding 48 hours reviewing the high-gloss folders I had distributed, realizing that a man who orchestrates a decade-long kidnapping and mail fraud scheme is a liability that no amount of real estate equity can offset. Simultaneously, the shimmering facade of my sister Madison's personal life collapsed with a speed that not even I could have predicted. As her husband, a man whose own political aspirations relied on the pristine reputation of the Vance name, filed for legal separation before the local news cycle could even hit the evening broadcast, citing the discovery of a fraudulent background and a total breach of marital trust. While the estate in Chestnut Hill was being dismantled by process servers and frantic crisis management consultants who weren't nearly as talented as I am, I was already overseeing the final move-in details for my new $4.5 million penthouse in the Seaport District, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the Boston Harbor that represents the first space I have ever occupied that wasn't subsidized by a lie. This new home is a masterpiece of minimalist design, filled with white marble floors and custom Italian furniture, but its most important feature is the intentional absence of family photos, as the silver frames that once held frozen images of our collective deception have all been tossed into a dumpster behind the Mandarin Oriental. I have installed a state-of-the-art integrated security system from a firm in Switzerland, a $50,000 digital fortress that I personally control with a series of encrypted passkeys that no monthly retainer can bypass, ensuring that the only people who enter this space are the ones I have explicitly invited. The air in the penthouse is clean and thin, smelling of expensive sea salt and new beginnings, a sharp contrast to the suffocating scent of lilies and motor oil that had defined my existence for the last 10 years. Next month, Emma and I are flying to Tuscany on a first-class flight that I paid for with the bonus I received for closing my own family's accounts, and I have already secured a $1,200 a night private villa in the hills outside of Siena, a place where the only thing we will have to manage is the quality of the local wine and the length of our conversations. Emma is no longer a specter or a secret to be kept in a sentry safe. She is a living, breathing testament to the fact that you can survive the worst things the people who are supposed to love you can do, provided you have someone willing to hold the match while you burn the old world down. My parents and Madison are currently blocked on every digital platform I own, a total communication blackout that requires no expensive security firm or intercepted mail protocols, but simply the quiet, powerful choice of a woman who has finally realized that silence is not a burden when you are the one who chooses it. The $300,000 my father spent on his digital firewall was a drop in the bucket compared to the cost of the soul he lost in the process, and as I sit on my balcony watching the tide come in against the seaport piers, I feel a sense of equilibrium that $48,000 of therapy could never provide. The white peonies from the baby shower are likely sitting in a landfill now, rotting alongside the reputation of the Vance empire, while I am finally learning the weight of a truth that doesn't need to be managed or polished for public consumption. I spent 27 years trying to be the perfect daughter in a family that was anything but, scrubbing the blood off their marble floors until my own hands were raw, never realizing that the stains were actually coming from the foundation itself. Now, the only legacy I carry is my own name, and the briefcase full of facts that set me free, a currency that is far more stable than the real estate market or the fickle approval of the Boston elite. There is a profound, almost spiritual peace in knowing that the people who tried to bury you were actually just digging their own graves, and that the only thing more dangerous than a woman who knows where the bodies are hidden is the woman who decides to exhume them in the light of day. Family is not a matter of shared DNA or a name etched onto a hospital wing. It is the person who reaches through a 10-year wall of silence to send a wedding invitation even when they think you've forgotten them. And it is the choice to answer that call no matter what it costs you. My father's Patek Philippe watch continues to count the seconds of his new, disgraced reality, but my time is finally my own, a luxury that no amount of Vance family money could ever actually buy. The Italian travertine tiles in the Chestnut Hill kitchen are likely still stained with the wine my mother dropped, a permanent reminder of the moment her daughter stopped being a pawn and started being a player. And I hope she thinks of that every time she looks at the empty seat at her table. I have replaced the 2024 Porsche Macan with a model that has no tracking devices and no history, a vehicle for a life that is being built on a foundation of radical, uncompromising honesty. As the sun sets over the harbor, casting a deep purple glow over the water that matches the shade of the dress I wore to my sister's social execution, I realize that the fire I started didn't just destroy a legacy. It cleared the ground for something real to grow. Emma sent me a photo this morning of the luggage she bought for our trip, a set of high-end Rimowa suitcases that look like they could survive a plane crash, and we laughed about how we were finally going to have the vacation we planned when we were 17. The debt of 10 years has been settled in full, the interest paid in the form of my father's career and my sister's marriage, leaving me with a balance of zero and a future that belongs entirely to me. I do not regret a single folder I handed out or a single frame of the 1080p footage that shattered their world, because a lie that big deserves a death that is equally spectacular. I have learned that the most effective form of crisis management is not to hide the disaster, but to be the disaster that clears the way for the truth to emerge from the wreckage. My name is Amelia Vance. I am 27 years old, and I am finally living a life that is not a performance, sitting in a home that is not a stage, surrounded by a silence that is finally, beautifully, my own. The 2024 Arctic white Mercedes GLE that Madison used to drive is currently being sold at a loss to pay for her mounting legal fees, and the $12,000 Bose system I used to broadcast the truth has been dismantled and sold off as part of the estate's sudden liquidation. Everything they valued, the appearances, the obedience, the unearned prestige, was shown to be as fragile as the crystal glasses that shattered on the terrace, leaving them with nothing but the cold, hard data of their own cruelty. I am no longer mourning a ghost near Route 9, nor am I paying a therapist in the Back Bay to help me navigate a survivor's guilt that was never mine to carry. I am a woman who exhumed a decade of lies and found her own life waiting underneath the soil, intact and ready to be lived. The Tuscan villa is waiting, the seaport penthouse is secure, and the firewall of my choice is ironclad, proving that the most powerful thing a person can do is to stop protecting the people who never bothered to protect them. Family isn't who stays when the lies are profitable. Family is who remains when the truth finally comes out.